all yours.
All right, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to speak here. So today I'm going to be talking about a project that I worked on while I was a graduate student and postdoc at CCRMA, and also while I was working at Shazam. This is a collaboration between academia and industry. So music discovery is the topic. And if you're interested in more details about what I'll be talking about today, there's actually a full paper. It's open access, so please do take a look if this is interesting to you. So in terms of music discovery, we encounter music throughout our everyday life, and so opportunities for music discovery are present all the time. Raise your hand if you've ever heard music playing around you and wondered what it was. Anybody? Okay. Raise your hand if you've ever had to resort to any of these methods to figure out what it was. So, trying to figure out what the lyrics were, create a web, call a radio station, or look up the playlist. Okay. Ask an expert, so maybe resort to singing it to a friend visiting a record store. All right, so these, I think, were pretty common practices before we had smartphones. But luckily now, in the past 15 years or so, we don't need to do these things. So now we have services such as Shazam. So when you hear some music playing around you that you don't know, you can simply open this app and press a button, and hopefully you'll receive the correct identity of the song. So based on this, this is actually giving us a lot of data about how people discover music around the world. So the question is, are there any meaningful and generalizable characteristics of music discovery behavior? So music discovery is not a new topic of research. There's been some past research on this, but it's been very limited to studies with small sample sizes. So an interview study by LaPlante and Downey found that when you're deliberately engaged in music discovery, so when you're setting out to find some new music, people find that both useful and enjoyable. However, a previous diary study by Cunningham and colleagues found that actually most of our exposures to new music are in passive encounters, and by this it means they don't happen when you were actually trying to find new music. At the same time, there's been a trend in the research community where we can use these new technologies and the data from new technologies to study different kinds of musical behavior. So Twitter is a very popular form of data to use in music information retrieval research because it's easy to obtain. You can actually use Twitter data to learn about people's Spotify behaviors because you can look at when people tweet Spotify URLs. Gracenote is a metadata company who just released a big data set, and some researchers have used the Nokia mixed radio music download data to study things like people's genre preferences and linking music download to things like personality factors. However, there hasn't been much about what industrial data can tell us about music discovery in particular. So in the present study that I'll be presenting right now, it's an analysis of a massive data set of Shazam queries. And by massive, I mean we have over 188 million data points here. So to kind of focus our analysis, these queries reflect just 20 hit songs. And what we'll be looking at in particular is when during a song do people perform queries. And so you'll hear me talking about offsets. So by offsets, I just mean the point in the song when the query was performed, so relative to the start of the song. So we'll be looking at the distribution of query offsets over the course of a song. We'll look at how this behavior changes when songs become popular. We'll look at some salient musical events and how those impact people's query behavior. And then finally, we have a lot of data, so we can actually look at how much data we actually need to ask these questions. So first, we selected the songs that we were interested in looking at. And for this study, we selected the top 20 songs from the Bilboard Hot 100 year-end from 2015. So this is kind of an industry benchmark of success, and it's also encompassing multiple genres. but mostly pop leaning, I believe. So working with this set of songs actually gave us some advantages for our research. So one is that we have this abundance of data for each song. So these are the most popular songs, therefore they're likely getting the most queries. They're globally popular, so we're getting data probably from a worldwide listener base, not just from one country. And finally, as you probably know, popularity is fleeting. So we can actually look at the life cycle of a hit song. So what does query behavior look like before it becomes popular versus once it is popular and once it's not popular anymore. For our data set, we aggregated all of the Shazam queries corresponding to these songs. So Shazam data has a lot of attributes you can think about when someone performs a query. Shazam is getting a lot of information, so what time, what was the date, when were they performing within the song, which is what we're looking at. Sometimes you can get location, things about the person's phone. But for today, we're just going to look at the date of the query and then the offset within the song. So we aggregated all of the queries corresponding to these songs from the beginning of January 2014 through the end of May 2016. And for each song, we got between roughly 3 million and 19 million queries. So our total data size is, as I said, over 188 million queries. And if you're interested in doing things with this data set, we actually publish the data as well. So it's made available for non-commercial purposes through the Stanford Digital Repository. So now we need to come to our research questions. So our first question is, do queries happen at special points in the song, or are they just equally likely to occur at any point in the song? So if they're equally likely to occur anytime, you would see a distribution of queries that looks kind of like this. So in this plot, we have time on the x-axis. So you can think of this as where in the song are you? And then on the y-axis, we have the number of queries that occurred at each point in time. So in this plot, you can see that you're getting kind of the same number of queries no matter where in the song you are. So this would be what we call a uniform distribution. And if this were the case, we would actually have to conclude that there's no relationship to where you are in the song and how many people are performing queries, and the study would be over. Luckily though, when we looked at the data, we actually found that the query offsets are not uniformly distributed. So in these plots, each of these plots is a song, and so the x-axis of each plot is spanning the beginning to the ending of each song, and the y-axis is telling you the volume of queries that were performed at each time point in the song. So there are a few interesting characteristics. So first, it's not flat, so it doesn't look like what we saw on the previous slide. We're actually seeing prominent peaks for all of the songs, and we're also seeing this general kind of downward slope. So this means that as the song goes on, fewer and fewer queries are being performed. And in fact, our quantitative analysis confirms that we can conclude that those were not uniform histograms. For our second question, we wanted to know whether people's query behavior was different for popular songs. So there were some anecdotal findings around the Shazam office that popular songs get queried earlier in the song. So this is something that we can actually look at quantitatively. So what we did is we went into that hit song life cycle, and we created 3 distributions of queries for each song. So we took the first 100,000 queries after the song was released. We took 100,000 queries when the song was peaking on Bilboard, and then we took 100,000 at the end of the data set when presumably the song was no longer popular. And then what we can do is we can actually quantitatively compare each pair of distributions to see whether more queries are occurring toward the beginning of the song as it's moving through its life cycle. And in fact, we did find some interesting results here. So in this plot, each column is a song. So this is song 1 right here. And then each row is each of those points in time. So the top row is each song when it was released. And then this is each song at its Bilboard peak. And then this is each song at the end of the data set when it's probably no longer popular. And if you focus on what's going on in the colored rectangles, you can actually see that as we go from release to Bilboard peak to end of the data set, there's a greater concentration of queries that are occurring toward the beginning of the song. So this is really interesting to me because the musical content itself hasn't changed. It's the same song that's being queried. However, the behavior of the users is changing, and for whatever reason, people are making the decision to perform queries earlier on in the song. And we did a statistical analysis with this, and we found that, going from release date to Bilboard, about half of the songs had statistically significant changes, and when you go from the Bilboard peak to the end of the data set, all of the songs were showing this trend toward queries occurring earlier on in the song. So for our third question, we want to know, so there's already some evidence from the histograms that something is going on, and queries happen more sometimes than others. So we want to know whether what we call salient musical events are actually driving these queries. So some more anecdotal evidence. We thought that perhaps people were performing queries when the song part changes. So maybe when a verse occurs, there would be some queries. And then when the chorus starts, people would perform queries again. So you're getting this change in musical content that might prompt people to Shazam a song when the previous content did not. So here's an example from one of our songs. So this is our histogram. If you know the song, it's The Hills by The Weeknd. So we have time on the x-axis, we have queries on the y-axis, and what's happening here with these rectangles is that the rectangles are showing you the different song parts. And so you can see some structure, for instance, when we go from verse 1 to verse 2, there's a peak. When the chorus starts, there's a peak after that. When the chorus comes back, there's another peak, and so on. And so what we did is we chose 3 salient events that occurred in all of the songs. So every song has a start. Every song had a first time that the vocals came in, and every song had kind of a verse-chorus structure, so every song had a first chorus. And we did an analysis of the histogram slopes, which means that after these events occur, do more queries start happening at some point in the future. And it's important to note here that when you're trying to link events in the song to the query action, I don't think that most of us are going around with Shazam open on our phones all the time. So when you decide that you want to perform the query, there's actually a delay where you have to get out your phone, load the app, and then the moment you press the button is kind of what's registered as the timestamp here. So our results from this are that actually our histogram slope analysis did show that these salient events were followed by an increase in queries. And in particular, after the vocals came on for the first time and after the start of the first chorus, there were these massive increases in slopes. And so this figure here is kind of a little adjustment of the previous figure, and what I've done is I've actually shifted the histogram back in time by 6 seconds to kind of estimate the delay based on these results. And you can see that once it's shifted, the structural segmentation boundaries where the song parts are changing are actually corresponding very well to these dips in the histogram that are subsequently followed by a peak. And so we think that doing these types of analyses, if it is true that our song part hypothesis is correct, it can actually help us characterize how long it takes people to perform Shazam queries, which is also useful. So our final question is, how much data do we really need? So we selected songs that we thought would give us more data than we needed. So at a minimum, we had 3 million queries for a given song. So we can actually do some analyses to see what would be necessary to get what we consider an appropriate amount of data. So we did this by, for every song, we would kind of split the data in half, and then we would compare the two halves of the data as we increase the number of observations in each half. And so what happens here is the more data you add, the more similar your two splits will become. And we do this over a lot of splits so that we can generalize the results. So this is an illustration from two of the songs at different sample sizes. So we have one song over here on the left, one on the right, and these histograms represent all of the queries for these songs. So to the best of our ability, like we consider this the true distribution. And you can see that with as few as 500 queries, the general shape of the true histogram is already kind of apparent. And to my eye, I think that once you get to around 10,000 queries, we're getting a pretty good approximation of the complete distribution. And based on some analyses that are reported in the paper, we found that with 26,000 queries, you can get a pretty good approximation. And with 104,000 queries on average, you can get a very good approximation. So we didn't need 3 million queries. We probably could have worked with far less, and this is really useful to know because it means that we can do these types of analyses with songs that were not quite so massively popular. So just to summarize what we found in the paper, we find that people's decision to perform Shazam queries is not random. It's not likely to occur equally at any point. It actually varies over the course of the song. And the timing of the queries, so you can think of this as the point at which we feel compelled to take action, can be driven by salient musical events, such as vocals and choruses, but it can also be influenced by other factors. So maybe our familiarity of the song makes us want to query it earlier, or maybe we're querying it for a different reason once it's become very popular. And we've also found that with as few as maybe 26,000 observations, we can gain some meaningful insights from this kind of data. So with any study, it's important to kind of acknowledge the advantages and disadvantages of what you're doing. So Shazam data obviously offers a few advantages. So one is the scale. This is far beyond what you could collect in a controlled lab study. These data are ecologically valid. So this means that people were not brought into a lab and asked to perform queries. These are actually things that people do in everyday life. And in a sense, they're objective. So if you think of the primary use case as learning the identity of something that you don't know, that means that there's this extra level of motivation that comes from the musical content itself, and not from what you know the content will say about you. Of course, we have a lot of disadvantages. So with this kind of data, we have a lot of unknowns. We don't know who the users are. We don't know why they were performing the query. We don't know where they were. We don't know if the application failed several times or if it was an incorrect tag result. And as I mentioned, we don't know actually when they intended to perform the query. And I think it's important to note that Shazam activity can reflect interest in something, but it doesn't necessarily reflect preference. So when people decide to Shazam a song, it doesn't mean always that they like the song. It just means that they wanted to find out a bit more about it. And finally, it's important to note that Shazam is not needed in every listening situation. So if you're listening to something on Spotify or Pandora, you don't need to use Shazam because you already have the information about the song. So we think that it's primarily used in listening situations where you're not controlling what's being played and when you don't otherwise have access to the song information. So just to conclude, we can now study new types of musical behaviors like music discovery on a large scale, and these technologies that have emerged in the past decade and a half, they not only let us engage with music in new ways, but they also provide new ways to study musical engagement, discovery being one form of music engagement. And so we have some future work with this. We're looking more into the musical events, so going beyond those very coarse events that I talked about. And if you can characterize that well, perhaps you can predict for a new song when people are going to perform Shazams, or maybe you can optimize your song to generate the most Shazams. And the research group at CCRMA has some other ongoing collaborations using other types of data attributes. So that's the end of my talk. I just want to thank my co-authors, Shazam, for letting their data be used for research purposes. And in case you're interested, the Stanford Music in the Brain Symposium will be happening at CCRMA next month, and this year's theme is performance.